Thank you. I'm on mic one. Good afternoon, everyone. We're looking forward to another presentation by Dr. Chadwick. This afternoon, he is going to be discussing geology and fossils. And I know we're excited about this. Don't forget about our concert and the evening program. We're going to bow our heads for prayer right now and ask God's Spirit to attend us as we prepare to hear from Dr. Chadwick as God unveils the myth of evolution. Our dear, kind, loving Heavenly Father, we recognize that we cannot fully understand Thy Word unless You send Your Holy Spirit to bring understanding and revelation. We ask for understanding and revelation so that we might have transformation. So, Lord, speak through Your manservant in a powerful way this afternoon. We ask You to be in the pew and in the pulpit. And may we not just be hearers of the word, but doers of the word in Jesus' name. And for His sake we pray. Amen.
Good afternoon. Today we're going to change from talking about things that are abstract to things that are, at least with me present, actual research that I've done, and that'll be the case for today, tomorrow, and Friday. Today we will talk about fossils and the flood, geology and paleontology. Tomorrow we will talk about time. That'll be a challenging lecture. And then Friday, we get to talk about dinosaurs. And I just came back. I haven't even been home yet from a month up in Wyoming working on the dinosaur project. So that'll be very current. So today, we're going to talk about sedimentation studies and what they tell us about a possible global catastrophe, something that involves the whole globe. And we'll also talk tomorrow more about sedimentology and how sedimentology is consistent with a catastrophic global flood. But today we're going to talk about the properties that we see in the rocks of sediments. So is there evidence for a global flood in the rocks? We'll start out by identifying what sedimentary rocks are so that we have a basis for talking. And then we'll talk about paleocurrents and what they are, and then what paleocurrents can tell us about the processes on the Earth. And then what can we conclude from the study of paleocurrents about the past history of the earth. What if I had to show today a video showing the process of the flood? Would there be room to sit down in here? I think everybody would want to see it, I think. It might be pretty scary, but we don't have a video of the flood yet. Maybe someday. But we do have the ability to reconstruct the events that took place during the flood, or at least in the history of the earth, from the study of the rocks. So, what can we learn about the past history of the earth from studying the sediments? What are sedimentary rocks? These are the kinds of rocks that are made up of little particles of material that have eroded away from other rocks. So really, they're grains of sand, they are clay minerals, they're all kinds of things that can be transported from place to place by either water or by air. So sedimentary rocks are rocks made up of sand, mud, clay that have settled out of a fluid. And that fluid most often is going to be water, at least if you have a global flood. But also you can have sedimentary rocks that are formed from transport by air as well. Such rocks are designated by the particle size from which they're made. So clay stones would be very fine rocks, fine-grained rocks. Siltstones, a little coarser. Sometimes we call siltstones mudstones. And sometimes if they have the ability to split, we call them shale. And then you can have sandstones in the sensu stricto and conglomerates. So sandstones are the kind that if you bite on them, you won't want to bite on them, right? If you bite into a geologists test rocks with their teeth all the time. That's why sometimes they have worn down teeth. But the way you tell a clay stone is you bite the rock and it doesn't bite back. It's actually soft and smooth and creamy. And in fact, they put clay in ice cream. They put it in paint to make it smooth. So clay stones are very fine grained, and you can identify them by biting the rock. Siltstones, you look at the rock and you don't see any sand in it, but if you bite it, your teeth will tell you there's sand in it. That's how you identify siltstone. And sandstone, of course, you can actually see the grains that are in it. Now, what are paleocurrents? Paleocurrents, paleo means ancient or fossil, and current means flow. Paleocurrents are indicators in rocks of the direction of flow of the material that was depositing the sediment. So all sedimentary rocks, because they exist by virtue of having moved in water, usually, all sedimentary rocks have paleocurrent indicators, and some of these you can read and interpret. For example, we have cross-bedding in sandstone. Cross-bedding occurs because the wind coming up, in this case, wind would be the same with water. The wind coming up from behind is compressed by the presence of a dune. When it's compressed, it blows faster because you're traveling the same amount of air in a smaller space. So it has more competence, ability to pick up sediment and carry that sediment. So it's going to pick up sediment on the backside, and then when it gets to the top of the dune, suddenly it has more space, less competence, it drops the sediment out, and so the sediment accumulates on the front side, and that causes the formation of what we call crossbeds. So you can see here in this illustration here, you can see which way the wind was blowing, in this case, from right to left. Here are some actual peels from crossbeds in sand, and you can see that the bottom layer at least is easily discriminating that the direction of movement was from left to right. I have to make sure it looks the same on the screen. Here are some actual beds of sandstone. These are the Coconino sandstone at the very bottom of the Coconino sandstone in Grand Canyon. these beds show a direction from, in this case, from right to left across the screen. So cross beds give us a direction of flow. We can also get a direction of flow or a sense of flow. Sense means which way was it going. Direction means a line in a plane. So in that case, we should be using the word sense. But here you can see some ripple marks. Ripple marks also give both sense and direction. We can see that the movement, in this case of air probably on this sand dune, was from left to right across the screen because the steepened slope is on the front side of those ripples. Here are some fossil ripples from down the bottom of Grand Canyon. And these are moving, the current was moving from the upper left to lower right, but of course it was flat when it was being deposited. Besides crossbeds and ripple marks, we can also get directional indicators from other kinds of rocks. These are called scour marks. They're usually on the bottom side, they're casts, so they are filling in where there was a depression made by something dragging along the bottom. And you can tell that they are going in the right and left direction here. Most of these are on this piece of rock. We can also get paleocurrent indicators from the study of fossils that are oriented by flow. So here you see some cone shells in this deposit, and they're all lined up together. So if we're going to study paleocurrents to try to find out something about the history of the Earth, we're going to need a lot of them. We can't just take a paper and see what it says and say, okay, that's what paleocurrents show. For our purposes, because we're interested in what's happening on the whole globe, we have to do a lot of work to get those data. We started out with theses and dissertations in libraries of major universities, in geology departments all over the world. And we went to these universities, we went through their theses and dissertations, we found the papers on sedimentology, and we dug out the data. We also, more recently now, can get a lot of this data online. We have in our database results of over 1 million different measurements that have been made of paleocurrents throughout the geologic record in our database. We have a lot of coverage, as you would expect, in North America, but also South America, Australia, Great Britain, parts of Western Europe, China, Africa are fairly well represented. We have some representation of Antarctica, Eastern Europe, and other parts of Asia, and then very little in Russia. This is a publication that we published, Dr. Leonard Brand and I, Dr. Brand at Loma Linda and I, along with Mingmin Wing. And we published this in Nature, Scientific Data, because I was afraid that all this work I'd done would stop when I died. So I didn't want that to happen, so I figured we better get this out there. So we published it in Nature Scientific Data. This is what it looks like. These are the coverages around the world. This is how much data we have. Each one of those dots represents a set of data. There are about 35,000 data sets which have varying numbers of measurements in them. This is the coverage in the geologic column. You can see from the Precambrian on the left-hand side to the recent on the right-hand side, and the colors represent different parts of the world. So you can see, again, the blue at the bottom is North America. You can see that that's where the best coverage is. So what? How are we going to interpret them? What do we expect to see from the standard model? The standard model, by the way, whenever I say standard model, that means millions of years, evolution, and long ages, slow processes, and so on. So that standard model, that means what most geologists believe. What do we expect to see from a catastrophic global flood? Then we'll say, what do we see? We'll look at the data, and then we'll ask which model fits the data best. What can we learn from that? First, we have to learn a little bit of geology. This is a humorous representation of a sedimentary basin. Sedimentary basins are the places where sediment accumulates on the land area. So here we see, in North America, we see the current sedimentary basins. Interestingly, all of these basins are open except for one, the Great Basin, which is in Nevada and Utah. The Great Basin is the only closed basin in North America today. All the rest of these empty out into the ocean, so sediments would be transported eventually down to the ocean. Only in the Great Basin can we have the accumulation of modern sediments. It wasn't so in the past, according to geologists. We had on North America a number of different basins, here indicated by varying colors, and you can see that many of these basins are described as being closed. The one that you probably may be familiar with is the Michigan Basin up there in the middle of the Great Lakes. But all of these basins were described as being closed. So according to the standard model, remember what that means. According to the standard model, we would expect to see on North America, in these basins, we would expect to see paleocurrents flowing into these basins from all sides. So we would see something like this. So if you took all the paleocurrent flow across North America today, it would be mostly going out into the oceans. But in the past, with all these closed basins, you would see paleocurrents going from every side. I tested this idea by going to my professor at University of California. He is currently head of the department there, but at that time he was a sedimentologist. And I said to him, what would you expect to see if I showed you all the paleocurrent data for North America in one map? And he said, I would expect to see white noise. You know what that means? In other words, no directionality at all. So that's the prediction of the standard model. If we had a global flood, you might expect to see processes that are bigger than basinal, bigger than continental. In fact, you might even expect to see processes that were worldwide. So we're going to take a look at the actual data now, and we're going to see which one of those two models fits best. White noise or global directionality, or at least continent-wide directionality. So we'll start here at the Precambrian down at the bottom, and then we'll go up through the geologic column, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, and on up into the tertiary. We'll look at Paleogene and Neogene. So we'll start with the Precambrian. Now, Precambrian, whatever it is, probably does not represent flood sediments, because there are no fossils buried there, no Metazoan fossils anyway. So we think this probably represents something that happened before the global flood. So we would expect that maybe the Precambrian would look different from the rest of the geologic column that we think was deposited during the flood. So here's what we actually got. And by the way, the number of data points down at the bottom, it says 53,000 something. So that's a lot of data. That's 53,000 measurements that were made on a rock outcrop. So those don't look like 53,000 arrows. The reason for that is, in order to display the data, I divided the screen up into 10,000 boxes, and then I averaged all the data in each box so you can see, you can actually make out what's going on. And notice there are some trends in various areas, but if you average over the whole continent, it looks like this. Pretty much a non-directional data. That's called a pie diagram. Each one of those petals represents the number of observations in that particular direction. All right, so now let's look at the Paleozoic. Do you see a difference? Suddenly we're dealing not with isolated things going this way and that way, here and there. We're looking at a pattern that covers the entire North American continent. And it looks like in general things are going from the northeast to the southwest across the continent. Well, that's interesting. That is 319,452 data points. That's a lot of data, but it's covering a lot of area as well. So let's break it down and go through Cambrian. Well, you can see that trend there, except on the east coast, you can see that trend in the Cambrian. Up next is oh, by the way, the colors on the map show where there are sediments. So we've just mapped the sediments and the kind of sediments they are onto the continent. You can just ignore those for our purposes today. That's the Cambrian. There's Ordovician, again from east to west. Silurian, east to west. Devonian, east to west. Mississippian, 50,000 data points from east to west, southeast, northeast to southwest. And then the Pennsylvanian, a huge amount of data in the Pennsylvanian. There's 109,000 data points there. And it's mostly going toward the south from the east to the west, southeast, northeast to southwest across the continent. And then the Permian, there's a little bit of tendency back toward the west. Well, that's not what the geologists predicted. That's not what the standard model predicted. This is something different. All right, let's go up to the Mesozoic. Now, remember the trend of the Paleozoic when we go to the Mesozoic so you can compare them. So I'll just go back quickly here and remind you. Here was the way the whole Paleozoic looked. That's the bottom part of the geologic column. Those are the layers down in Grand Canyon. And now we're going to go ahead to the Mesozoic. And notice the Mesozoic, do you see a difference? Yeah, they're going back the other way. There's a trend toward the east from Mesozoic. So we started at the bottom with the Triassic. It still looks like the Permian. And then we turned to the Jurassic, and now it's going back the other way. So there's a change that takes place in where everything's going there between Triassic and Jurassic. And then Cretaceous, Lower Cretaceous, and Upper Cretaceous, and on up into the Paleocene, it remains the same. Well, that's amazing. No geologist would have predicted that based on their understanding of the deposition of sediments across North America. When we come up to the Cenozoic, I'm just going to summarize that as a rose diagram. So here's the Paleogene, the bottom part of the upper part, and then this is the Neogene. You can see there's no trend there. So the geologic column ends up looking like the Precambrian. But in between the Precambrian and the Cenozoic, you have this very strong directional trend in the Paleozoic, and then a reverse trend on that in the Mesozoic. Keep those in mind. We'll encounter that again. North American paleocurrents are variable, show no distinctive continent-wide patterns. Paleozoic, we see patterns that are strongly directed from the northeast to the southwest. Mesozoic, that reverses. And then the Cenozoic, it goes back to the way it was in the Precambrian. These trends are not expected in the model of conventional basinal geology at all. As I said, I tasked my professor at University of California with this data, and he predicted clearly you would not expect to see directionality. These trends show sedimentation on a scale larger than that predicted by conventional geologic models, suggesting such models may be inadequate. These trends are consistent with what we might expect in connection with a global flood. It's not that there aren't possibly other explanations that I haven't thought of, but at least for now, peg that one up to a global catastrophic process. Let's take a quick look then, what happens if we put all the continents together. Do we still see that trend? Conventional geology isn't even thought of on that basis. People think about their little basin that they're studying. They do not think about all of North America, and they certainly do not think of Pangaea, the giant supercontinent that was supposed to have been in existence before all this took place. So let's take a look at the supercontinent. Here I've put all the continents in places that are appropriate for them according to our understanding of geology at present. So that's one big giant continent. All right, let's throw the Precambrian on there and see what we see. This is what you see in the Precambrian. There's some trends that you can see here and there, but by and large, what you see is no trend. And we're now going to go just to the Paleozoic, and we'll look at that. Remember the Paleozoic in North America? Which way was it going? Northeast to southwest. Watch South America. You've already seen North America. Watch South America. Precambrian, it's kind of mixed up. Okay, here's the Paleozoic on the supercontinent. Look at that. The same trend that we saw in North America is also in South America. Same trend we saw in North America is also in Africa. The same trend we saw in North America is also in Australia. The same trend we saw in North America is also present in India. They're all affected the same way on a global scale. You see how the directionality is here in the Paleozoic. Now I'm going to show you the Mesozoic. Watch for that change. South America has the same change we saw in North America, from mostly toward the west to mostly toward the east. And the rest of it we won't try to explore, except just to say that we see those same kinds of trends. And clearly, there are patterns of flow that are present here that should not be there. And then the Cenozoic. The Cenozoic is a mixture that I won't try to interpret right now, but it's not the same as the Paleozoic and Mesozoic. All right, well, what can we conclude from that? Those are a lot of data. As I said, there's 1 million data points there, distributed over the whole world. We see similar trends on different continents at the same time. What is going on? Continent-wide paleocurrents are unexpected, that is, they're anomalous, but they've been recognized for a long time. We've known that there were bigger than basinal currents in North America. Supercontinental trends are unexpected, unrecognized, and probably cannot be accommodated in conventional models. You cannot fit these trends we saw in Pangaea, or Gondwana and Pangaea, you cannot fit that into a normal standard model. Because the standard model is predicting you got this basin with things going in and it, this basin, things going in and it. That's what you should see. What we're seeing is the whole world is a basin. And whatever is going on, it's a whole lot bigger scale than anything geologists are equipped to think about. A global catastrophic flood can explain the observations, and that's a good reason for us to keep it in mind when we're thinking about geological processes. All right. Moving on now to fossils. Because I only have 5 lectures here. So I've got to fit more than one thing into a lecture. What do the fossils tell us about evolution? And here you can see the famous horse series showing the evolution of Eohippus into Oligohippus, Oligohippus into Merychippus, and Merychippus into Pliohippus, and then finally we get the modern horse. Is that real? What do fossils tell us about evolution? And we're going to talk about 2 things today, the Cambrian explosion And then we'll talk about fossil sequences like that horse sequence and see what we can learn about that will help us understand where we came from. Do fossils support the theory of evolution? Again, we're going to the geologic column. I figure if I show you this a couple of times, you might get an idea of how it works. At the bottom is a Precambrian. Those are layers of rock that do not have fossils in them, at least not metazoan fossils, multicellular animal fossils. And then we have the Paleozoic, and that's where we have the animals start, and then the Mesozoic and Cenozoic above that. The Cambrian explosion, that sounds like something big, doesn't it? The Cambrian explosion is this. Down here at the bottom, you have the Precambrian. The very first layer above the Precambrian, where I said there were no multicellular animal fossils, is the Cambrian. In the lower part of the Cambrian, we have representatives of every phylum of animal, every major phylum of animal. Some animals don't even leave fossils, but every major phylum of animal is represented in the lower part of the Cambrian. Below that, nothing. That's why they call it an explosion. Interestingly, when they first appear, it's not just one representative of an animal, it's a great diversity of those animals, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Darwin says the absence of Precambrian precursor fossils is a serious challenge to his theory. Here's his quotation. He's talking now about down here in the Precambrian, where you have rocks that look just like the ones in the Cambrian. He says, there's another allied difficulty, which is much more serious. I allude to the manner in which species belonging to several of the main divisions of the animal kingdom suddenly appear in the lowest known fossiliferous rocks. The case at present must remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained. Here's what we find in Nevada, in a particular spot where the lower Cambrian is in contact with the Precambrian, Precambrian below, lower Cambrian here. In the lower part of the lower Cambrian, we find 12 species of trilobites from 3 orders and 6 families. Where did they come from? Where did the evolution of these trilobites take place if they evolved? We already talked about the fact that evolution is a non-starter for explaining these, but let's just ask the question, where are they hanging out until they got buried there? That we don't have any record. We find Saltarella, I'll show you what that is in a minute, archaeocyathids, brachiopods, mollusks, bivalves, and gastropods, algae, trackways, burrows. Below this layer, there's nothing. This is worldwide. Nothing down here. You come to the Cambrian, suddenly you find representatives of all the major phyla of animals. Here are some trilobites just for record. 2 of these are not from the Cambrian, but 4 of them are, just to show you the diversity of trilobites. Saltarella is an unknown taxon. We don't know what it is, but it's there. This is archaeocyathids. Archaeocyathids are sponges, and sponges are, believe it or not, are exceedingly sophisticated organisms. They have one of the most complex cells in the animal kingdom. The choanocytic cells are in sponges. So they're not trivially there. They are there as a specific, very complex form called archaeocyathids. We find brachiopods. Now, brachiopods, if you don't know what brachiopods are, brachiopods look like clams, but they're not clams. They're a entirely different order of animal. And you can tell the difference from a brachiopod and a clam because brachiopods, the line of symmetry is down the middle of the valve, and in clams, it's between the 2 valves. That's where the line of symmetry is. So they're very different organisms. This is a modern brachiopod up there in the upper left. that you can see what they look like. They're still around today. They are in the Cambrian, many species. They are here today, still. There were mollusks of all different kinds found in this deposit in Nevada. Darwin says the absence of a Precambrian precursor fossil is a serious challenge to his theory. And I quote that same statement again. There is no evolutionist that can explain how these animals got there, why there are so many, why they are all there suddenly at the same place at the same time. The sudden appearance is profound. The Precambrian is virtually free of metazoan life forms, yet nearly every major phylum is represented in Lower Cambrian, and they are already diverse at their first appearance. You see the problem there for evolution? If you can't explain how you can evolve something, which we've already discussed, then how do you explain the fact that there's nothing and then everything's there all at once? That's a serious problem. Okay, let's take a look at fossil sequences like the horse sequence that we discussed earlier. The discovery of fossil sequences has been expected and anticipated since Darwin. He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ, or animal you could say, exists, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would be absolutely break down. In his imagination, he said, I can find no such case. Then he turned right around. He said, if the theory is true, it's indisputable that before the Lower Cambrian strata, that's what we're talking about, long periods elapsed. And during these vast periods, the world swarmed with living creatures. To the question why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earliest periods prior to the Cambrian system, I can give no satisfactory answer. The case at present must remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained. If you cannot show a progression of forms from this form to this form that came from it, then he says that collapses down his whole theory. Do we have such fossil sequences? The answer from Stephen Gould is there are very few and they're not very good. But we all have heard about hominid fossil sequences, the horse sequence, and there are some others here, dinosaurs to birds, land mammals to whales, and some other ones. There are a few that are put out there as being valid sequences of fossils. So we need to address that question. I'm going to address it by some quotations. Colin Patterson was the head paleontologist at the British Museum. Here's what he said, quote, this is quoting in response to Sutherland, who wrote a book called Darwin's Enigma. He wrote to Colin Patterson, he said, hey, why don't you show some sequences of fossils in your book to help us understand how these things evolved? Here's what Colin Patterson wrote in response. I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. He didn't have any. He didn't show that this became this, became this, became this, and finally became this. If I knew of any, this is the head paleontologist at the British Museum. If I knew of any, I certainly would have included them. You suggest an artist should be used to visualize these transformations, but where would he get the information from? I could not honestly provide it, and if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? He went on to say, yet Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. How many? None. If evolution is the explanation for what we see in the fossil record, it ought to be full of these transitions from one form to another. Stephen Gould and the American Museum people say there are no transitional fossils. You say that I should at least show a photo of the fossil from which each type of organism was derived. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. Well, when this book was published, Darwin's Enigma, a anti-creationist by the name of Thanusen got a hold of it. And he wrote to Patterson, and he said, "What are you doing opening it up to this kind of criticism? Why did you not do something to cover yourself when you wrote this book?" And Patterson wrote back and said, "Well, he wrote accurately what I said, and I stand by it." And he said, "I gave this reason. The reason is that the statement about ancestry and descent is not applicable to the fossil record. It's not even a term you can use with respect to the fossil record. Why? Is Archaeopteryx the ancestor of all birds? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. There's no way of answering the question. So we can't even begin to answer these questions about these sequences. David Ropp, who was a paleontologist at I think he was at Chicago, he may have gone to Columbia. He says, "We're now about 170 years after Darwin. The knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. The record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transitions than we had in Darwin's time. 170 years after Darwin expected us to have filled in all the gaps in the fossil record. We now have fewer examples of transitions than in Darwin's time. By this, I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. The more we learn, the less we know." What appeared to be a nice, simple progression when relatively few data were available now appears to be much more complex and much less gradualistic. So I put it on this next slide so you can see it. This is the way it was in Darwin's day. Eohippus developed into the modern horse. Everybody knew that. You learned it in school. It was in your textbooks. Eohippus has since been taken off the chart, not even considered to be an ancestor. And down below is the modern representation of the so-called evolution of horses. Notice that many of these horses are together at the same time. So how could you say one of them was the progenitor of another one if they're all there at the same time? So we actually know more data and less about the evolution of the horses. That's from David Ropp. Let's see what Stephen Gould says. He was the dean of evolution at Harvard, very well known and respected paleontologist. He says, quote, "The extreme rarity," okay, we're talking about sequences, right? We're talking about sequences of fossils leading from this fossil to this fossil. Evolutionary sequence. The extreme rarity of transitional forms, the transitions in between here, is the trade secret of paleontology. The extreme rarity is a secret we keep to ourselves. The history of most fossil species includes two features particularly inconsistent with gradualism. Gradualism, as I indicated earlier, means a gradual change from one form into another. Two features inconsistent with gradualism. Number one, stasis. What does stasis mean? Doesn't change. Most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on the Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. So number one, no change. Number two, sudden appearance. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once, fully formed. So we have sudden appearance. That means there are no ancestors. We have long periods of stasis. That means no change. And we have sudden disappearance. So we have no descendants. That's what evolution tells us from the fossil record. Donald Prothero is still alive. He's the only one of these that is. Here's what he said about stasis. Quote, in my dissertation on the incredibly abundant, well-preserved fossil mammals of the high plains, I had over 160 well-dated, well-sampled lineages of mammals. You see the word lineage there? That means a linear relationship. So he was looking, he wanted to show that evolution was real. He wanted to show that you could see these transition stages. So he studied in his dissertation, only a graduate student would do something like this, 160 different lineages of mammals in the high plains. He was looking to see if there was gradualism or stasis. I also had a wide geographic area from Montana to Saskatchewan to Texas. I had large fossil samples of many species with dozens at each level and excellent stratigraphic data. When I analyzed my data carefully, it was clear that nearly every lineage showed evolutionary change. No, stasis. Nearly only one exception of 160 lineages, one of them, a little Monocurus, I think it was, changed slightly in size from top to bottom. I could point to this data set and make the case of prevalence of stasis without any criticism of bias in my sampling. More importantly, the fossil mammals showed no sign of responding to the biggest climate change of the past 50 million years. Out of all the 160 lineages of mammals in this time interval, there was virtually no response. The evolutionists hypothesized that climate change was the biggest driver of evolution. And yet he saw that these lineages of mammals he was studying went through what the evolutionists, what the standard model said was a major climate crisis at the Paleocene, Eocene, and there was no change. So in his hands, it takes away the one driving force that evolution had, which is climate change. It didn't have any effect on these 160 lineages of mammals. Now, is Donald Prothero a creationist? Absolutely not. He's an anti-creationist. Our beloved brethren at La Sierra hired him to come down there and teach them about evolution. He hates creationists. But what is he talking about? He's talking about creation. And there's no way of getting around it. These mammals did not evolve. There is no evidence of gradualism in these lineages or in other lineages. And somebody will say, since this is a what about lecture, what about the whales? Well, let's take a look at the whale lineage just for a second. This is supposed to be a representation of all the different forms in the lineage from these land mammals like Indohyus to the whales like Dorudon, Eodocetus, and so on. On the left-hand side here is the order in which the fossils are actually found. Is that the left hand? Sorry, on the right-hand side is, no. On this side is the order in which the fossils are found. On this side is the order in which the evolutionists expect them to appear. As you can see, they're not in the right order. In fact, they're basically all out of order. Furthermore, these are supposed to be evolving into whales. So I thought I would take Rhodocetus and take a look at it so you can see a close-up. You can see where it is on the chart. Doesn't that kind of look like a half whale? Yeah, it's got kind of a body that's looking more like a whale. Here's the actual data. There's the animal. And here's the depiction of the artist who puts flippers on its feet and a broad tail. The tail doesn't look broad at all. We don't know what this animal did. We don't know if it's related to whales. It seems to be based on its teeth and other skeletal characteristics. It seems to be in that same lineage, but there's no way this thing couldn't walk around on land. So we don't really know very much about it. Sure, a weird-looking thing. So if the theory is true, that is Darwin's evolutionary theory, he says, it's indisputable that before the lowest Cambrian strata was deposited, long periods elapsed, and that during these vast periods, the world swarmed with living creatures. To the question why we don't find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to the assumed earliest periods, I can give no satisfactory answer. The case at present must remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained. What we find is sudden appearance, long periods of stasis, sudden disappearance. This is, according to his own words, a valid argument against the views Darwin proposed. So what do the fossils tell us about evolution? Cambrian explosion, we have the sudden appearance of animal forms. Where's the evolution taking place? If you're an evolutionist, it's all taking place below the dotted line from Monday's talk in the Precambrian, where there are no data. The fossil sequences, traces of the new forms in the fossil, evolution of new forms in the fossil record, we don't see any evidence for that. We have organisms coming into the record, staying the same, and going out of the record without any change. So do fossils support the theory of evolution? That's a question I put to you just now. So let's then review what we've learned. Sedimentation studies reveal patterns that are global, consistent with a global flood. Tomorrow we will learn that sedimentary processes appear to have been universally rapid and continuous, consistent with a global flood. Monday we learned all complexity already present in the first fossil organisms, at least at the cellular level, is consistent with creation. We just finished talking about how all phyla of animals represented in the first layer containing abundant metazoan fossils, you have nothing, and then suddenly you have representations of all of the fossils already diverse. Consistent with creation. And we just saw that changes in species almost never are seen in the fossil record, a condition consistent with creation. For me, I feel quite comfortable as a scientist. Without all the answers, and we'll see tomorrow we don't have all the answers, without having all the answers, I feel quite comfortable believing the story in Genesis. Thank you.